It's great to see such an enthusiastic crowd for this afternoon. Thank you for joining us. I'm Harriet Hamassi, University Librarian, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this commencement forum, and you've already seen the title, The Impact of Social Media on what? On politics, on culture and scholarly communication, all sponsored by the University Library. The idea for this forum grew out of the library's increasing changes in that we are as present virtually as we are physically, including the delivery of online content and online reference services and outreach services, as well as the library's increasing efforts to help students and faculty make use of digital methods and tools to explore, develop, and share their scholarly ideas and questions. To help us understand this growing impact of social digital media in so many parts of our lives are today's panelists: David Korn, American political journalist and author, and chief of the Washington Bureau for Mother Jones; ALISSA QUART, executive editor and Economic Hardship Reporting Project, and author of several books, including Branded and Republic of Outsiders; ELIAS MUHANNA, Brown University Manning Assistant Professor of Comparative Literature and frequent contributor to The New Yorker Online. The panelists will begin by sharing some of their viewpoints and will eventually invite participation, so please have your questions and comments ready. Please join me in welcoming today's panelists.
Thank you all for being here. I think I get to start. I'm David Korn, class of '81, and proud parent of a daughter who will be starting here in September. And I remember many days in this room trying to stay awake when I was on the other side. I hope we keep you all on your toes with this chat. Whenever it asks me about the information age and social media and what's happened with the digital revolution, I am reminded of my favorite New Yorker cartoon. And to be a favorite New Yorker cartoon, it has to be really damn good. And it shows Charles Dickens sitting across the desk from a copy editor, and the copy editor has this very stern look on his face, and he's saying, "Now surely, Mr. Dickens, it could not have been both the best of all times and the worst of all times." But when I think of the digital revolution, I really think that's kind of where we are. As someone who benefits greatly from digital media, I feel it's been empowering. I worked for The Nation magazine for 25 years. I worked for Mother Jones. And for a long time, people who were not in the quote-unquote mainstream media, I don't mean that in a pejorative sense, had a harder time reaching audiences. Audiences that wanted information that didn't appear in the New York Times or network news had a hard time finding it. I mean, when I worked for The Nation, I would compete with, or at least I thought I would compete with, reporters from other more established organizations, and it would take me weeks or days to write a story. I'd send it in, and it would take a week or two before it would come out on paper, and then somebody would put a stamp on it, take another week or two to come out to only subscribers. Anybody else who might have been interested in this almost could never see it. If I thought there were people out there, people of influence who might benefit from seeing my work, I would make Xeroxes of it, fold it up, put it in envelopes, write addresses on it, and put stamps on it, and just send it out. And that's what I would do if I had a big scoop or anything like that. Thanks to the digital revolution, a lot of the gatekeeping functions have been blown up. And thus, people, whether it's me or whether conservatives or people just who are non-ideological but are working outside the mainstream media universe, now have access to great audiences. And Mother Jones, we get up between 10 and 15 million visitors a month. We break stories which I think compete now with other major organizations, as does BuzzFeed and Daily Beast and Talking Points Memo and the Daily Caller and Washington Examiner, things on the right, as well as bloggers from across the world who sometimes find things out ahead of any organized journalistic entity. And so we have a much freer information ecosystem with the barriers are much lower. And I think that's actually a good thing. The bad thing is that now anybody can do it, and that we're flooded with information. And bad information, which is cheap to produce, often costs nothing, travels these byways as easy as good information. And so in the election that we just had, some of the biggest trafficked stories on Facebook were literally fake news, created as fake news. Somebody created the Denver Guardian newspaper online site, which doesn't exist, and would put up a story saying the Pope has endorsed Donald Trump. And that story itself would get more clicks and more impressions than anything the New York Times, Washington Post, Mother Jones, or anybody else would do. And so that means, while the forces of truth and accuracy have greater access, so do the forces of propaganda and lies. And when you have a system like that connected to a political ecosystem that I think has become more and more tribalized and divided, you end up having confirmation bias run amok, where people see the things that are either accidentally or by purpose are designed to reinforce pre-existing notions, some of which may be based on false information, quite purposefully so. And so as our society has become more divided politically and hyper-partisanized, the information system that surrounds it bolsters that. And it becomes very hard to do anything in terms of persuasion. And that's either if you're an opinion leader, an author, or a politician. How does a red state politician reach blue state voters and vice versa? And so, as we saw in the last election, it was mainly about each side trying to turn out people fully committed to them, and less about persuading others to join them. And I think that's not necessarily a healthy thing for a country as fractious as we are, facing a load of complicated issues that often require strong foundations of information in order to have an informed opinion that you can then use to elect a politician who will make an informed decision. So in some ways I feel like the battle between good and evil, between truth and false, between progressives and conservatives, but between progressive in the terms of working towards communal answers versus the forces that don't want that would like people to use, be more fearful, and the forces of demagoguery. It's all been kind of intensified, and everything happens at a quicker pace, and the blows are kind of like machine gun style, just one after another, one after another. Just think about long time ago when Donald Trump fired Jim Comey. It seems like months ago now. I mean, we used to have news cycles. Some of you in this room are old enough to remember when an event would happen, and you wouldn't hear about it until the next day, maybe. And then, you read about it, think about it, and then people would talk about it for a couple of days, maybe longer, depending on the nature of the event. And it would kind of settle in for sort of a decent national discourse. And now we have, about 17 news cycles a day. It takes one tweet, sometimes from just one guy, to turn everything upside down. And the media, and a lot of the consumers of the media, a lot of people in the political world, are really like, packs of animals just chasing shiny objects back and forth all day long. And it's pretty grinding. I know it is for me, working in that space. I think it's pretty grinding for people absorbing it. So I think while we're faced with these profound challenges, Our society is more fractured than ever politically, or as fractured as it's ever been. It was pretty fractured in 1800 and during the New Deal times and things. We collectively seem to have ADD, and we have a president with ADD, and it's just become very hard to have the type of conversations we need. I do diagnosis really well. I don't do remedies as well, because I don't quite know at the end of the day what the solution is for this. I think some type of information literacy is needed. I think there are some mechanism remedies. I think Facebook could deal with and Twitter could deal with the fake news stories by being more greater interveners in this on these matters. But how you get people to read beyond their biases and to accept facts that don't conform with prejudices or biases they begin with is really, really difficult. Of course, it goes to education, but how do you change that? That's difficult too. So, I'll finish with this. I think it's, these times, everyone probably has said this at any point in human history, that their epoch is pretty damn complicated. I'm sure when they built aqueducts for Rome, they said, boy, this is really going to complicate things a lot. But now we really face a time where truth is probably more malleable and under siege than ever before. And I think it's very hard to become disheartened by this. When Howard Kurtz of Fox News tweeted out a Fox News poll showing that, according to their numbers, Trump has dipped further in his approval rating, people who follow him, Fox News watchers, went nuts and said it wasn't true. So when you're facing that happened just a couple of days ago, what do we do? I think everybody just has to sort of buck up and figure out how they can get the best information they can, share it with others, and try to think of ways to not contribute to rumors, speculation, and the transmission of news and information that's not solidly derived. And most importantly, for all of us sitting here, support. That means pay for news, information that is good, that is solid, that does cost a lot of money to produce. By supporting, and whether it's the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Mother Jones, or the National Review, you take your pick, the New Yorker, you make a pitch for yours. That's one thing, because we're all under siege economically and politically, and that support will help a lot.
So hi, I'm ALISSA QUART, and I'm class of '94, and I remember being in this room, I think art history, architectural history, whatever, new descending or ascending the staircase. It's all coming back. It's a flashback of early 90s imagery. Anyway, so I run a nonprofit, journalism nonprofit, which I will talk a little bit about when I give these notes to you guys, but we need this. We need nonprofits, journalism nonprofits funded, and we also need publications. Mother Jones is a nonprofit.
We're a nonprofit.
Nonprofit also. And basically, most decent magazines are nonprofit at this point. So it's just something to consider. You can support people through your subscription, but you can also donate. So I don't know about you, but I've had insomnia off and on since about 11 p.m. November 8th, 2016. Yeah, everybody? And so now the alt-right is within American power, and it's fueling even higher levels of sleeplessness by the fact that it used the same mechanisms that groups of American outsiders who I think most of the people in this room, this is Brown, cherish, have also used, which is social media. So the alt-right has used the same techniques that Black Lives Matter has used. Gay marriage advocates, and Elias will discuss this too, Arab Spring organizers. The big issue now, if it cuts both ways, and the Black Lives Matter spreads the truth on the ground at Ferguson, and the alt-right uses social media to distort truth. It's not just the alt-right, it's also these video game fanatics who harass real live women online when they get tired of harassing virtual ones in their video games, right? It's just general white nationalists who are normalizing far out political positions faster than we can say not Pravda. It's beliefs that just a year ago were beyond the pale. We need to look no further than Trump's angry tweets to see that happening. So I wrote about this in my 2013 book, Republic of Outsiders, how animal rights activists, transgender activists changed what was considered normal in America. So they were using Twitter, Twitter bots, Facebook, Instagram, Snapchats, YouTube, videos, memes. They also use neologisms. So alt-right is a perfect example of this, right? What I mean by that is like a new coinage, a new phrase, and that sticks in your head. I'm really glad that people have pushed back against the term alt-right because it really covers up what is neo-fascism, basically. But that is a technique. So when we look at how outsiders spread their message and get into the mainstream, you should track the new phrases that people are using, because that's a key. And if you are trying to, if anybody here is an advocate who is trying to get a movement across, this is one of the great techniques, is coinages, okay? And part of why that's important right now is because we live in this attention scattered economy, you know, an attention economy as opposed to an economic economy. And this is what people, and I call attention hacking, using new terms. So attention hacking means using memes, like the neo-Nazis use Pepe le Frog. I don't know if you guys are familiar with this, which is this horrible mascot. They use this new language also. So attention hacking is one of the techniques that people use to get out of the margins and into the center. So the alt-right has co-opted these outsider social media methods to create the most toxic political fictions. In the last months of the election, as David was saying, fake news stories got more Facebook engagements than real political coverage, like statistically. And more than 44% of Americans get their news from Facebook. 44%. So that's astonishing, right? That doesn't mean that they're not all going through to the Times. Some of them are, but they're also getting stories about Monica Lewinsky's son, David. I don't know, this was a big fake news item, who was found dead in Central Park. And if any of your high school friends are posting that, you don't go to your high school reunion and look for traditional news sources. So as I said before, you know, another thing that the attention hacking thing is huge, and that you know, basically we could talk about how that works, but you know, it is using these phrases, using these fake stories, these constant tweets. It's the barrage, and it's the equivalent of running across the campus naked with the insignia written on your body. It's like out of control, right? So we have to be careful about getting attention hacking, just getting distracted by that, and watching a whole populace get distracted by that. But so I want to go back to the case of Black Lives Matter, because it's also really, really positive for a lot of movements. So that's one of the things. We don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater here, to turn back the clock. It's had a revolutionary effect on marginal communities. Black Lives Matter used social media brilliantly, forcing conversations about police killings of black citizens. The posts by activists were essential in spreading the news of Michael Brown's death. A teacher, a school administrator, and a government employee got 200,000 followers on Twitter. So these were non-professional journalists. And they were reporting on their own reactions to Brown's killing. And then they were creating stories around mainstream news. And there's a good study, if anyone's interested, by Dean Freelon of American University on how that worked as a movement, how like BLM did this. And a lot of their success lay in critiquing mainstream news accounts. So again, it cuts both ways, right? This is very important that we have voices outside of the mainstream. So there is Black Lives Matter on one hand and the alt-right on the other, and which will win? I wish I could tell you. It can feel like there are two Americas and the gap is unbridgeable. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my organization, and not in a pitchy way, but just because I do feel like you were talking about information literacy and alternatives, and I hope that nonprofits like our nonprofit can help change this. So I run a reporting nonprofit dedicated to covering income inequality. It's called Economic Hardship Reporting Project, and I run it with Barbara Ehrenreich, who wrote Nickel and Dimed. And a third of our recipients are low income. So it's not just about supporting people like David and Elias, although I hope they will write for me one day. It's also supporting people who are low income, writing about their own experiences, because this is another account. These are marginal voices that need to get attention, right? And they're not. And so I'm constantly trying to come up with like emoticons for the recession and other attention hacking strategies, because I really do think it's important to use what the alt-right is doing and flipping it. So our pieces are immersive. Like an example would be somebody who grew up in a mining community writing about mining, an Appalachian woman who's a single mother writing about how fracking has affected her body and she's gotten sick from the environment. I give grants. So each person gets $1 a word plus expenses, and we place it in Harper's, New Yorker, Atlantic, like major places. And the point is that writers are finally getting paid. Now, the reason that's important is the Great Recession reduced newsrooms up to 40% in rural and Rust Belt areas. So the reason this is important is who is reading the fictional news? It's people often places where the local news doesn't exist. So they're not using the Times. They think that's an advocacy publication or mainstream or elite. And then their actual local or agricultural newspapers or whatever they would turn to in the past have gone or become non-relevant or no longer functioning adequately. Whereas people like us in Washington, New York, Eastern Seaboard are getting plenty of jobs, et cetera. It's less difficult for us. And I think if we can address these news deserts, we can try to counter the rise of false news via social media in the heartland. So I'm starting this initiative called the Heartland Project to give money to journalists in these areas, in Montana, West Virginia, et cetera, to write for their local newspapers, and I'm going to give them money to do this. And so, because I want to read work that is written by professional journalists who actually live in Pennsylvania. It's really sad to say this. Pennsylvania is like a swing state, right? And Alabama, instead of just flying in for a beer and some quote pillaging and then they're back on JetBlue to Brooklyn. No. I want to get people who are actually living in these places, grew up there, and are professional journalists to tell the stories. So this time is fraught with confusion and despair, but I believe in the power of real and deep journalism. And because I'm sick of not sleeping enough, I think it's time that's ripe with hope. I think trying to reach these readers in local and agricultural papers and sites is the thing to do, and I can tell you all more afterwards if you want to get involved. And you might want to do this with us because we all need to sleep at night. Thanks very much.
Well, hello, everybody. Unlike David and Alyssa, I did not go to Brown, but I teach at Brown, so I'm the face that your students see in this room as well, I've taught. So I want to just speak very briefly about this problem of fake news and social media, which to me is a teaching problem. It's a problem that's an occupational hazard for me. It's a problem for me in my job, working with your kids. Okay, so let me explain that. I spend a lot of time when I'm not teaching at Brown, thinking and following the news coming out of the Middle East. I'm a professor of classical Arabic literature and Islamic intellectual history. So I spent a lot of time thinking about the Middle East. And what's interesting about what has been happening in the Middle East for the past 10 years is that the whole fake news issue came, for once in the history of the world, came to the Middle East before it came to America. We have been dealing with the effects of WikiLeaks and the fragmentation of the news media since about 2009. Does anybody here remember the Iranian Green Movement, the election in 2009, which for the first time, it seemed that Twitter and Facebook were good for something besides sharing cat videos. That people were using these media to organize and get out on the street and to provide a counter-narrative to state media and even to cable news. We are finally beginning to see the potentially positive effect of these kinds of organizations. That quickly changed when governments in the Middle East figured out how to use these kinds of media for their own purposes. And also, not just governments, but reactionary forces, people who favored the status quo, began to deploy the same techniques. And at the time, 2009, 10, 11, I began to feel, as I was following the news out of not just Iran, but when the Arab Spring began, and you began to see huge demonstrations in places like Egypt and then Syria, that what was interesting was that, yes, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook were being used as platforms to disseminate counter-regime news and to document human rights abuses, but they were also being used by people, not the regimes so much, but people who favored the maintenance of those regimes. And so what happens is a very difficult situation emerges where every time you read the news or you turn to any news delivery platform, you approach it with a greater store of cynicism and skepticism. It's not the case that our biggest problem is, I really believe that our biggest problem is not the fact that there is fake news out there, that people are getting the wrong news. That is certainly a problem. The bigger problem is that there is just too much news. Some of it fake, some of it true, some of it in between. And that when people turn to this enormous universe of news, they have their their level of skepticism has been ratcheted up so high because they have time and again found that something that they believed was not true, that they don't even, we don't even have the cognitive organs to see real news to identify real news when we see it. And this is where I'd like to bring it to your kids. For a long time, humanities professors believed that our primary goal, or one of our primary goals, was to teach your children critique. We want them to leave our classes with precisely that higher store of cynicism. We want them to leave our classes with a well-developed skepticism, to never accept things at face value, to evaluate information. The question is, how, in a way, I feel like now I'm letting these students out into the world, prepared to enter the fake news universe, right? But not being able to put the world together again. In a way, it's very easy to take the world apart in this environment. We're all doing it. It's very easy to poke holes in things, to point to other sources of evidence on the question of who's popular and who's not, what actually happened in the White House. There's a million counter-arguments for everything that you find online. The really difficult thing is, how do you put it all back together again? That is now what I see is my job. It's not just to teach your kids to be insufferable skeptics, okay? I think we're all now insufferable skeptics. The challenge is really how to put things back together in ways that make sense, in ways that can be measured against some kind of value system. And here, I'll just close with this. I think that in a counterintuitive way, the digital world actually provides an answer. It provides a kind of remedy. And it's what I like to think about it. I like to think of it as a difference between short attention span social media and long attention span social media. Not all of social media is short attention span social media. Sure, there's Twitter, there's Instagram, there's Snapchat. I mean, there are some kinds of social media that are designed purely to be short attention span. But then you have things like Facebook and the blogosphere and forums like Reddit, which actually, in a way, provide a kind of long attention span, have the ability to provide a long attention span form of engagement that we don't have in face-to-face communication. I want you to imagine that we all were going to start a conversation, a political conversation right now. All of us. Everybody in this room was going to start talking at once. It would be impossible. We wouldn't actually be able to have a conversation. You wouldn't be able to hear yourself, let alone anybody else, over the din. But digital forums actually create an environment where you can have hundreds or thousands of people participating in a conversation at once. And I know this from my experience in blogging, where in the comment sections of a blog post, you can have a very sophisticated conversation taking place often over weeks or months about a certain issue, where people are engaging with each other. I mean, I'm talking about like respectful comment forums, not the sort of troll magnets, right? Where there's plenty of places like that. But in certain situations, those forums enable a kind of conversation that is remarkably efficient in the way that it brings together different opinions, and it exposes people, even the ones who aren't actually participating actively, to different kinds of ideas. So, like Alyssa, I believe that there's no way, we can't turn back. We just have to find ways of leveraging the potential of these platforms to figure out how to put the world back together, how to produce narratives that are compelling, that are rhetorically effective, and that conform to some kind of value system, rather than just using them to take apart the narratives that are out there. Thanks.
Listening to you guys, I had a few thoughts, and then we're going to ask for questions. And that is sort of a couple of different things. When I was on the floor of the Republican convention in Cleveland, not an experience I would ask too many people to go through. And when there were one of the times, I think maybe when Michael Flynn might have been on the stage and they were chanting "Lock her up, lock her up," I was talking to a person working, in the Trump campaign. I said, there's nothing illegal about what she did. There's all, you're making a phony issue here. Are you worried about investing so much in this? And he said, our voters only see the headlines. Only see the headlines. So if they see chanting, lock her up, they walk away, she should be locked up. That's about reinforcing their bias. When I was talking just a couple of days ago for a book I'm working on with one of the heads of Hillary Clinton's digital team during her campaign, and we were talking about fake news, he said the real problem was there'd be stories, across Twitter, across Facebook, which is a much different thing, where they would say Hillary Clinton is going to jail. He said it wasn't that we worried that people believed the truth of that fake news, and a lot of people don't even click on it. It was just the impression they got. Oh, something else about Hillary, going to jail. Okay, lock her up. Untrustworthy. And so, it makes me think, in response to particularly what you're saying about putting the world back together again. After Humpty Dumpty falls down, how do you piece it back together again? Is how do you get people to take the time, and it does take time, to be informed in the right way when there is this massive amount of information out there. People are under more economic pressure, meaning under more time pressure than ever before. Right. And so, it's great that you're doing this with your students, but, frankly, your students aren't the problem. And so how do we get people across the country, and how do we get campaigns that don't skeptically and cynically pander to what they call low information voters? And to me, that's just, gets back to sort of how do we design an education system in which people grow up and they get to go to college. We have more college graduates because you do see a pattern. It's, it sounds elitist to say, but there is a pattern between education and how you absorb information, and even voting patterns too. So, it's a bigger political question, and you have to sort of find a way to get around the barrier, which are people voting against this, to create educational priorities so that people become, able to read deeper in and develop that skill set.
Well, one of the things I was going to say about information literacy, and I think that's the term we should use, not media literacy, because this is information, not traditional media. I talked to a librarian about this before I came to talk. I said, what would you recommend, like a library science person? And they said triangulation, which is, this is for our kids, okay? This is not, so read 3 different stories from 3 different sources. Tell your kids to do this and compare them. And stop just looking for good sources, but look for good stories. So if we're just going to assume that, I mean, another counterexample that struck me too was even if we're trying to tell our kids that the Times is the place to go, what about the WMDs in Iraq, you know? I mean, there's a lot of, even the bastions of great journalism are now somewhat compromised, right? So we can't just say, go to the Times, go to, I don't know, wherever we want to tell them to go, but also look at different versions of the same story and start to like make critical assessments based on that. So that was one thought. Another thought is Facebook News. Facebook's investing a lot of money in news initiatives. Facebook Live is paying $3 million to the Times and also to BuzzFeed to get them to use Facebook Live as a platform to get legitimacy. I think of no better way for any of these tech companies to get legitimacy than to start investing in information literacy for young people, because that's going to be a counter to a lot of the things they're producing. Like, forget about just funding news. Let's teach people how to read in a real way. So there's some thoughts.
Elias, do you want to add?
I think I'm happy to cede my position to folks in here and get a question.
Okay, so we have about 18 minutes for questions. If you have a question, I think we have to go to the microphones. And really going to ask people to try to keep them to questions. Now, you know, if you have an introductory statement, just a sentence or two, please, because we'd like to get through as many of these as we can. So less in speeches, more in questions. Why don't we start here and go back and forth?
Okay, so my question is
Can you just identify yourself?
my name is Jacob Kirschenbaum. I'm graduating on Sunday.
Congratulations. Woo!
Now the fun starts.
So my question is for David and Alyssa. I just want to clarify your position a little bit before I ask the question. So you were talking about how the alt-right works to, using social media, memes, Pepe the Frog, whatever, to distort and obfuscate, the truth and the information. And in this age, we need to be wary of those kinds of agents in the, information market. Does that sort of make sense? Okay. So Nietzsche said there's there are no facts.
You can take this one.
I can do this. Okay.
There are no facts. There's only interpretation of facts. And I think when you say that this is about information literacy, I think it's reductive because it is about media literacy, because this is media. Everyone presenting information is performative and they have their own bias. So I think failing to recognize that is reductive and is part of the problem we have. I think talking about the alt-right and putting them in a box, like we put the Tea Party in many years ago and called them racist, and so putting the alt-right in a box and calling them Nazis, I don't think if that's the best way to have the conversation and have the open dialogue. Do you think that? Thank you. I think that we saw what happened after calling the Tea Party racist for 8 years. They won more congressional seats than in any president's term ever. And Donald Trump is now the president. So I think, if David's talking about having open dialogue and not having a polarized media, don't you think that positions like that are sort of against the grain in that way?
You're asking two different questions, though.
Yeah, okay.
So one is a question about information that
You take that one.
Oh, yeah, so the Nietzsche point. So, I actually really like what Elias said about questioning our, fixation on criticality as opposed to treating information as an object in the world. So I think that's part of your argument, right? You're saying that there is no information qua information, it's just all we have are multiple points of criticality?
Once you call one thing information, you're calling another thing not information, and someone who believes in that is certainly not going to consider the information at all. So if we respect everything as people bringing opinions to the political arena as they are, I think that's how we're going to have the conversations and have that open dialogue, and not have these polarized conversations.
But there are. I think.
There is information. I love how the relativism of Brown in the 90s has shifted. No, that's what I'm hearing. I'm hearing a historical shift in ideas of how we're thinking about relativism, and so I kind of want to talk to you because I feel like this is really interesting. Is this? I just start to want to report on this though. I want to know is this how people think about relativism now? Is this the thing? Is this you or is this a thing?
No,
I just want to know. Yeah.
This is a real point. This is a real point
Okay.
about...
No, it's real. No, I know, but is it a framework that really smart, like Brown students are thinking? Is this like a...
I think relativism is very pervasive on this campus, and I think it's very difficult to establish any kind of just standard value here. So that's definitely a big challenge of this century, and I think it's reflected in this social media conversation. There's no standard of truth. There's no standard of anything, and so, obviously we don't want to just throw our hands up and shrug, and I respect the effort to say, there's good information and there's bad information, but I fear the danger of, and this was the question for David, was because he talked about how we have echo chambers of information or echo chambers of media talking to only their constituents about things and casting the other people in a certain way, and how are we ever going to be able to find any kind of middle ground?
Filter bubbles is what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Filter bubbles,
I mean, you're raising a lot of different overlapping issues.
Yes.
There are facts. It is a fact whether or not... Don't clap for that! What are you doing? The sky is blue! Yay! No, but there are facts. The Pope did or did not endorse Donald Trump. That's a fact. Okay? You can't say, because I believe it, it's legitimate. Because I read this website and I believe it. And so that indeed is something that we need to come to grips with and need to fight and not respect everybody's factual opinions. Now, when it comes to talking to the other side, so to speak, about how to reach out to them, you raise the issue like, what do you do with the alt-right? Now, I do think this is, and college campuses across the country are contending with this in terms of a free speech issue or not. If there is a group out, if someone is a white nationalist who takes a racist position, is that an opinion that is worth debating or not? This is a debate to have about in some ways. And do you want to say, okay, Richard Spencer, you believe that that blacks should go back to Africa? We're going to give you a forum at Brown University to explain that. And I do think that as a community, Brown or anybody else or your neighborhood can decide, to a certain degree, what opinions are worth giving more attention to than not. I mean, that's just the way the world works. You don't let any crazy person come in here and say, I believe in genocide. And so so it is a slope. I'm not going to call it slippery, but there is a slope in which at some point you can say, we don't accept the view, especially if you say there's science to gay conversion therapy, we're going to say, no, there is no science to that. Your scientists who say that don't have scientific degrees. And so we're not going to treat that as an equal opinion. But I understand that this is a very touchy and a hard to navigate territory, because you're saying no to some people and I think universities, I'm not happy if they invite, say, Dick Cheney to speak and give him $50,000, the guy who created a war that I think was based on lies. But if you want to bring Dick Cheney to speak, you do it a different way. We're not going to pay you, Dick. We're going to put you up there, and we're going to put Elias up with you as well, or somebody else, and have a conversation. Sorry, Elias.
I'm ready. Bring him on.
But
what's the harm to having that kind of conversation with Richard Spencer? Because lots of people believe what he says, and not to legitimize his views, but to put them out in the open and to say, this is how horrifying what you're saying is.
Because the same thing.
Instead of just dismissing and saying these people are Nazis.
Because I do think you get to, that a community like Brown, a church group, a magazine, any organization can decide where it draws the line.
Yeah.
You get that right to draw the line. And and if he says he'd like to see African Americans go back to Africa, literally. Okay, if he said, I think we should actually round them up and send them back to Africa, is that an opinion that deserves more attention? Because anytime you give someone attention, you are someone enabling it and legitimizing it to a certain degree. If you put Elias on with Spencer, it's a sane person and a not sane person, and the insane person gets an advantage from that. The same way that if you have a debate between a liar and someone who doesn't lie, the liar has an advantage, and the liar gets elevated. And that's part of the problem we have with a political discourse with Donald Trump. And I've gone on too long. We can talk more after about this.
Thank you.
That's
That's great.
But let's go to you.
Hi, so I'm Maggie Zellner, class of '87, and I have a historical question for you guys. So my parents were activists in SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. So I grew up quite skeptical of mainstream media because we knew that the New York Times was not always telling the truth or not always telling the whole story. But I love the Times and I subscribe to the Times. But I'm thinking about, how much is what's going on a difference in degree or difference in kind? Because if you think about the election between Jefferson and Adams, they were telling horrible lies about each other. But I'm concerned about if we're, moving towards a situation where we could actually have a civil war and it's really something new and different, or is this just a new development of something that has been present in our culture the whole time?
That's a great question. I think I take some solace in the idea that a lot of these changes that we see are cyclical. So what happens often is that technology generates a new way of communication or a new way of human engagement that seems really new. Maybe it isn't so new. And it takes a while for the culture to catch up with how to police it or how to think about it critically. It takes a while for it to routinize the charisma of that medium. And then it does. Eventually it does. At that point, there's a new kind of way of engaging, and there's something that's brand new that we have to grapple with. But I do take your point that it's, it's deja vu all over again, and there isn't anything new under the sun. So politicians have been slinging mud at each other since there have been politicians, and since there has been mud, really. And so that's not new, really. But I do think that we have to recognize that it is a difference in kind. It's not just degree. There has never been a moment in the history of our species when somebody could think something, not even say it, and just move their little fingers, and then within 20 minutes, 20 million people across the country have read it and have thought about it.
And one thing that's different too, I think this, what you just say, is that true, the 1800 election is one of my favorite elections because it was just so terrible. But what we have now with the technology change is that we had change, we went to, from books to print to newspapers to radio to TV, and a lot of that all still, from a commodity perspective, was only for elites. You had to be able to buy ink by the barrel. You had to be able to own a television station. What is fundamentally different in the last 10 years is now everybody has been empowered. So it's not just a change in politicians still arguing and throwing mud at each other. Now we have 300 million Americans all throwing the mud. And so it's the instantaneousness that people can do, but also the fact that it widens the ability of people to participate. And I wonder if to a certain degree, we saw in the 1990s, there was a militia movement that began, and how did it begin? Really through bulletin boards. People with different ideas who felt isolated in different parts of the country, now, because they couldn't connect through elite media information engagement channels, found ways to connect that way.
Pro-life use bulletin boards a lot.
So I think the technological changes have sort of changed the power equation a little bit. And so when you talk about catching up and policing, it may be sort of a different type of mechanism now that comes in after that.
But there's an interesting kind of concordance with or informal alliance between the left and the right on these issues, because traditionally speaking, people who have been committed to fighting injustice over many decades, they've been committed to certain kinds of causes that they felt were not properly represented by the mainstream media, whether it was the war in Vietnam or certain kinds of human rights, long-running struggles for human rights for certain kinds of communities, have long been skeptics of the mainstream media. And so it's like people who were marching in the street in the 70s are kind of like, what, you're telling me that the mainstream media doesn't get things right? Shocker. Like, we knew this way back in the 70s, right? So And on the right too, many people who felt that the media was liberal, the media didn't express their point of view, and they had to turn to other sources, also are saying, what, the media is biased? We knew that, we've known that for decades too. So the problem is that when you have such large portions of the American population who distrust the media and have for decades, again, it's a problem of, well, then how do you arrive through well-intentioned media, through fact-checking, through verification, at an economy of persuasion? How do you get beyond knowing what is right, what is fact, and actually communicating it to somebody? That's the challenge.
Let's go over here.
I have a couple of pails of cold water to throw on the notion that it's the best of times.
Do one pail.
Okay, then my first pail is, or my second pail, is that one of the things that is essential for democracy is that in any kind of public forum, it should be the case that in an audience pays full response and full attention to the people that are talking, whether they agree or disagree, in order to be able to find either flaws or strengths in what is being said. I don't know, I would not want to embarrass anybody in the room about the number of percentage of all ages of people in this room who listened to your entire presentation while they were on their phone. Okay, and I don't think that's funny.
No,
because it's a behavioral addiction that has become universal and extends across genders and across ages. And it's making it impossible for us to do what we used to be able to do with books. Now, you mentioned Black Lives Matter, and I'm very glad that they did present the unjustified use of lethal force in such a vibrant fashion. But that does not replace reading Michelle Alexander's magnificent work, The New Jim Crow, and actually getting into the social and legal reasons why this horrible system is developed.
That's a good point.
No, but I mean, I totally agree with you about the winnowing of attention. But one thing, Elias's point about long engaged, what was the phrase you used?
Long attention span versus
long
short,
attention span social media. So there are, I mean, people are reading long reads. I know this because I'm placing pieces in publications that are long form, and I used to edit a long form publication. People are actually reading, they are.
Except that there's been some peer-reviewed research that indicate that when we read stuff online, we read it in an E format, or an F format. We look at the front line, we run our eyes down the left side, and then we delve in the middle, and then we feel that we've read it. We do not really read for comprehension. We do not read carefully.
I think that this is a very good point, and I feel it again very personally as a teacher of your students, where I tell them, I've tried to do different things, but I've come very close to banning laptops in my classes, which
I do ban
which
laptops.
I don't like. I don't like to do because
Yeah.
many of them Many kids these days are just not very good mechanically at writing. They're much faster. I mean, no, they're expert typists, but they're just not as good. So I don't want to disenfranchise them that way. However, the case I make to them is, it's not your fault. It's not your fault that 50% of you are checking your phones in this forum. It's not because you don't find what we're saying interesting. Maybe you don't. But the technology actually is conspiring against you. It's impossible. And this is what I tell the students. I don't blame you, because I know what it's like. I don't blame you for checking Facebook and Twitter and your Gmail and a million times during the lecture, because it's addictive. It's very difficult to resist. Which is why instead we kill the Wi-Fi when they come in the room. It's the only thing that's going to work, you know.
We got time for one more. Can we not have a speech and a good question? Right?
Okay.
One more? Okay. Yeah, but I'll stick around.
We'll have conversations with anybody.
Berate us afterwards.
Okay. My name is Vladimir. I'm an American voter visiting Brown University, and I'm happy to see all of you. And here's my question. So as an American voter living in New York City, I actually was very confused reading Mother Jones, New Yorker. I actually, once in a while, watch Fox News just to see what they're doing. So everyone has actually their opinion. So my question is that among the people who are supporting and providing information through media, what do you think is the best method in such a way that voters like me And the voters I speak with will actually hear what's the truth versus focusing only on the headlines. And you're right, everyone talks about headlines. I spoke with many people and I asked, why do you vote for the current occupant of the White House? And they will tell me, because they want to make America great again. And if I ask, why didn't you vote during the election last November? Because they said Hillary is corrupt and Bernie Sanders should be the one who is the nominee of the Democratic Party. And because that didn't happen, I will not vote. So both extremes actually work together to get the resident of the White House.
Yeah. I think I think it's really difficult to try to teach people how to be media literate or information literate. It's sort of like nutrition in a lot of ways. People have to take some responsibility for what they take within themselves. Now, schooling and education can do a lot. Whether it's teaching kids how to eat better, how to read better, and what sources to look at. But it is incredibly, it's like, you blame the technology, it's hard, to not blame the media culture as well, because there's so much out there, and it's very hard to get through. People ask you what to read. The fact that you're looking at Fox once in a while is not a bad thing. Not too much, but it's not a bad thing. But I tell people, basically, and it takes a lot of work. You should read one of the major national newspapers. If you have a local newspaper, you should pay attention to that. You should go online and look at what Mother Jones is doing, or Talking Points Memo, sort of a more boutique place that doesn't cover everything. And if you want something just from a progressive viewpoint, go look at Washington Examiner, Daily Caller, whatever. I really think that if you read these things and you've been educated sufficiently, you can see where biases might get in the way. You can weigh facts. You can see how things are presented. But the real problem at the end of the day is this is work. It takes a lot of time to do this, and some people grow up being taught this by their parents, and it's part of what they do to be good citizens. And for others who don't, who just see the headlines and hear the headlines, the challenge is, and every politician has this challenge, how do you get them to think and hear something differently?
The great liberal philosopher John Dewey once said, a liberal is a person who can't win an argument with himself. And yet he was one of the greatest theorists of liberal philosophy ever. And what he recognized was that in its golden age, liberalism in the 19th century in Britain, the reason why liberalism was successful was because it was scrappy, and it fought. And it fought in the courts. It fought with lawyers, and it fought in the press, and it fought by dotting the I's and crossing the T's and being exacting. And when you fight in that way, it's often not easy to see the victories. Okay, now I'm not talking about liberal versus conservative. I'm talking just about pushing for freedom, which is something that I think liberals and conservatives support, right? Pushing for freedoms, pushing for truth, accuracy, protection under the law. This is the classical liberal ideas. And I think that is what we need to inculcate in our students and our children, this idea that it's hard work, as David said. It's not going to be a pithy tweet that is going to solve our problems. It's going to be getting in the trenches, getting down where it's messy, where it's difficult to sort out right from wrong, and arriving at it that way.
You want to give you get the last word.
I get the last word, oh boy. I guess I was even thinking we should have a sort of mandated part of in libraries and obviously public school curriculum. The problem is public schools are now underfunded. But to my mind, I would like to see, okay, whatever, media literacy, information literacy as a kind of mental hygiene for kids at young ages, that would be required. But how do we start to pay for this? I mean, I guess one of the ideas I had was to try to raise them from these technology companies that are personally guilty for creating this glut, Anyway, there you go.
Well, thank you very
Thank you
much,
all.
everybody.